The central figure of Christianity is Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus was a rabbi, a teacher, and so he was somebody who knew the Hebrew Scriptures well. The New Testament records incidents of him reading from the Scriptures, so clearly Jesus knew Hebrew. His native language was Aramaic. It had been the language of the Assyrian Empire, then the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, so it had been a common language throughout the Middle East for 1,000 years by the time Jesus was even born. Christianity arose out of Judaism. Early Christians thought of themselves as Jews, and thought of themselves as creating a new sect, a new variety, the true variety of Judaism. So, what is the Jewish background into which Jesus was born? That's a huge topic, and today I'll only scratch the surface, primarily by talking about a section of the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, known as the Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot. This is a section that lays out Rabbinical Judaism's conception of how we are to live. It could also be entitled, in fact, Fundamental Principles. These are basic principles that are intended for rabbis, but also for the Jewish population as a whole. Before I talk about the Talmud, however, let me spend a moment to talk about the Hebrew Scriptures themselves. Jesus, being a rabbi, is a teacher of the Hebrew Scriptures. And what do they consist of? Well, roughly speaking, what Christians today think of as the Old Testament. Let's talk a moment about the Torah, those first 5 books that lay out the law. There are 613 commandments in the Torah. That's a lot, obviously, and a difficult number to remember. So there are certain summaries within the Torah. One of them consists of the 10 Commandments, which talk about our relationship to God and our relationship to fellow human beings, and give basic ethical directives about how to relate to God and how to relate to other people. But the Torah also contains certain summaries of the law, basic principles from which the others are to be derived. The basic ones are those that Jesus uses as a summary of the law in the New Testament. So they consist of love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And also, love your neighbor as yourself. Those appear already in the Torah and are the basic principles that underlie all of the other 613 commandments of the Torah. I think it's helpful to draw some distinctions among the commandments that appear in the 10 Commandments and in general among ethical commandments. One of those distinctions is something stressed by Bahya, which is the distinction between commandments of the body and commandments of the heart. Some of these are external. They're about action, about behavior, about what to do and what not to do. Others are commandments of the heart. They have to do with how to feel and how not to feel, internal states of mind, and which ones are acceptable, which ones are unacceptable. The other distinction I want to stress is between commandments that are positive, do this, do that, and those that are negative, thou shalt not, don't do this, don't do that. And so if we draw those distinctions, we can see that there are naturally then 4 categories of commandments. Some of the commandments are positive and external. They are commandments of the body. So things like remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, or honor your parents. Those are commandments that are positive and external. Some are negative and external. Do not kill, do not steal, do not commit adultery. There are also commandments of the heart. Now some of those are positive. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. There are also commandments of the heart that are negative. Thou shalt not covet. There's another distinction we can draw among the commandments. The first set pertain to our relationships to God. They pertain to vertical relationships. So things like, don't take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Thou shalt have no other gods before me, and so on. Others pertain to horizontal relationships, relationships to other people. Do not kill, do not steal, do not commit adultery, do not covet. Those have to do with our relations to other human beings, but the first set have to do with our relations to God and our obligations to God. Now the Hebrew Scriptures are written in Hebrew. There are a few passages in Aramaic, mostly in the books of Daniel and Ezra, but otherwise it's all written in Hebrew. By the time of Jesus' birth, Hebrew was an ecclesiastical language spoken by only some people. Most people were speaking Aramaic and knew little or no Hebrew. So that required a special group of people who were trained in Hebrew, trained to interpret the scriptures, and could explain them to the others. That priestly class, if you will, grew up, a class of rabbis. They consisted of several subgroups. The most numerous were the Sadducees and the Pharisees. They certainly had different emphases. The Sadducees placed more emphasis on worldly success, and the Pharisees more on a relationship to God. What we find in the Talmud is more or less a summary of the views of Rabbinical Judaism, a summary of the views of the rabbis around the time of Jesus and in the preceding century, the subsequent century or two after Jesus as well. So the Talmud gives us a picture of what the rabbis, and especially the Pharisees, thought about the nature of the law and about the nature of our relationship to God and to each other. The Ethics of the Fathers, then, is a summary of all of that. Now, despite that, you would expect lots, then, of references within the Talmud to specific passages in the Torah, but you don't find that. You find fairly independent statements, and I think it's important to study those. When we read the New Testament, most of the references to the Pharisees are rather hostile. The Pharisees are hypocrites. They don't practice what they preach. But what do they preach? We get very little insight into that in the New Testament. And so I think it's important to begin with the Ethics of the Fathers so that we have some idea of what the ideals are that the Pharisees are accused of not living up to. What were the Pharisees preaching? What was the dominant view in Rabbinical Judaism? The Rabbinical tradition was primarily an oral tradition. However, after the fall of the Temple in 70 and the dispersion of Jews, many of them to Babylon, there was an attempt to start writing down the insights of the various prominent rabbis over the past several centuries. That effort continued for several hundred years, and eventually 2 bodies of Talmud at least began to be written down. One of them was the Jerusalem Talmud, and a much longer and more comprehensive Talmud emerged in Babylon. That's the one that people ordinarily are referring to when they simply talk about Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud. And that's where we find the Ethics of the Fathers. So let's talk about the view that appears there. The Ethics of the Fathers begins with a summary of the law that's very, very different from the summary of the law that appears in the Torah or in the New Testament. It's not a question of loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. Instead, here are the 3 basic principles that the rabbis put forward. First of all, be not hasty in judgment. Secondly, bring up disciples. And third, build safeguards, sometimes translated as fences or ramparts, around the law. Now, what does that mean? To some extent, those are principles given to rabbis rather than to the population at large, but I think they apply in a secondary way to everybody. Be not hasty in judgment. Bring up disciples and build ramparts around the law. Protect the law. This is really about preserving the tradition. The job of each generation is to pass on the tradition, pass on Judaism, pass on this civilization to the next generation. So what do you do in doing that? First of all, be not hasty in judgment. Don't be too quick to substitute your own judgment for the judgment of others, for the judgment of that tradition. Secondly, bring up disciples. Teach this to people. Have students. Make sure you don't simply follow the Torah yourself, but you pass the Torah on to others. Bring up disciples, not in the sense of trying to recruit followers so much as trying to teach others, educate others, pass this on to the next generation. And finally then, build safeguards around the law. The law is easily corrupted. There are all sorts of forces, temptations, from culture, from our own desires and emotions, from a variety of sources that are going to try to corrupt the law. You've got to figure out how to pass it on protected to the next generation. And so you need to protect it. You need to build fences, build ramparts, build protection around the law. It is something that is constantly in danger. So you have to be careful about your own judgment about it. You have to pass it on to others, and you have to protect it, guard it as you transmit it to the next generation. The main concern that underlies this, I think, is a concern for the tradition, for the civilization itself, for the religion of Judaism. How do you pass the identity of Judaism on to the next generation? And so you might think of this as a kind of civilizational consequentialism that is underlying it. Maybe that's too bold philosophically, but the idea is simply we have to preserve and, if possible, strengthen this tradition through our own efforts, passing it on to the next generation in an uncorrupted and ideally strengthened form. We are to add things if we can, but certainly not subtract things, not corrupt things, and be very careful about those additions, because the tradition is likely to be far smarter than we are. Now, in the Talmud, the rabbis are facing a general problem, and I think their commandments, their rules in general, are about trying to solve this problem. The problem is how you transmit a civilization, a culture, a tradition, a religion, a set of principles that tell you how to relate to God and to one another, to future generations. How do you preserve that? How do you set up a structure that prevents it from being corrupted and allows it to be transformed and to persist over centuries, over millennia? It's a difficult problem. It's one faced by the founder of any institution or any religion or any tradition or any form of government. It's something faced by the American founders. How do you set up a system and then have that system persist, be preserved, be strengthened ideally over time, as opposed to being weakened and corrupted and forgotten? It's a hard problem to solve, and there are various ways in which people might try to solve it. What are some of those ways? Well, one of them, of course, is what the Talmud itself consists in. Write it down. The oral tradition is something that's valuable and important, but on the other hand, easily disrupted, easily, destroyed even, by the death of those who are passing on that tradition. There are a number of points in the history of philosophy, for example, where there are serious disruptions, where, for example, the Black Plague or an invasion disrupt an entire civilization and prevent the further transmission orally of a certain philosophical tradition. The result of that is often a loss that takes hundreds of years to recover from. So an oral tradition is dangerous. Writing it down is one of the first things you can do. That's what the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds are all about. Writing down the statements of the rabbis, writing down what they had to say about a variety of things that emerge in the Torah. A second technique for trying to solve this problem is through axiomatization. Now that sounds a little bit mathematical, but the idea is simply to formulate some basic principles. Those basic principles can be easily remembered. Pretty difficult to master and remember 613 commandments, let alone all the various books of the Talmud that try to write down the Rabbinical Tradition. But it's much easier to remember, love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. And so coming up with fundamental principles is a crucial thing. In politics, this often amounts to writing down a constitution of basic principles, or something like the Bill of Rights. But in a religion, it may be a question of laying out certain basic ethical precepts. In a philosophy, it may be giving the basic principles, the basic insights of that philosophy. The idea is, look, you may forget, you may be corrupted with respect to lots of the minor stuff, but certain things are fundamental. And so almost every religious tradition tries to axiomatize, tries to give you some basic principles from which the others are derived. Now, not only does that facilitate the preservation and transmission of the tradition, but it also gives you a basis for trying to improve the tradition. You've got some basic principles, and maybe some of those minor principles later you decide to compromise on or change, or maybe you decide to add certain principles in that you think were missing from the original vision. Well, the basic principles tell you how to do that without corrupting the underlying idea, but instead strengthening and preserving it. A third way is to develop mechanisms for handling proposals for new ideas, new beliefs, new practices. All sorts of factors can lead people to have new ideas, new interpretations. Sometimes there's trying to solve real problems. Sometimes there's simply a fad, a trend, an intellectual trend, or something that's happened in the culture that leads people to demand change. Now, change can be good, it can be important to strengthening the tradition. The tradition, after all, has to adapt to changing circumstances. On the other hand, it's also a threat. Change can destroy a tradition and distort it beyond recognition. So how do we do this in a way that strengthens the tradition as opposed to weakening it? We have to have mechanisms for evaluating that. In politics, we have ways of amending the Constitution. In other areas too, we have ways of actually changing theological statements or other kinds of basic principles or highly derivative principles. But there has to be a mechanism. We have to set it up so that that is possible, but on the other hand, difficult, requires careful deliberation and some degree of consensus. Be not hasty in judgment, remember. Make changes, but make changes very carefully, very cautiously, and only when you are sure you're strengthening the tradition thereby. Another way is to develop something like a priesthood, a group of people who are tasked with preserving and strengthening the tradition. Membership in that has to be carefully guarded, of course, but that's to some extent what the Pharisees were, what the rabbis were. It's what the Supreme Court justices are in the United States. There is a group that is selected to be the ones who are in charge of all of this. There is a danger here in that an elite formed in this way can find that its interests, its concerns, its values diverge more and more sharply from those of the people at large. And so such an elite is a way of trying to preserve the tradition and keep other kinds of constraints from distorting the tradition, but it also presents a danger of its own. You can also, of course, use sociological factors to try to limit participation in the process of changing all of this. And so everybody might have the task of passing on the tradition, but it might be that only certain people get to make decisions about it. Now, on the one hand, you could have a small elite who have that task specifically, but you could also say, well, a much larger group should be involved in this. We don't want that kind of divergence between the interests of an elite and the interests of the people at large. On the other hand, we don't want just everybody to do this. We don't want the mob to be in charge of our tradition. That really is going to corrupt it very, very quickly. So what do? We start noticing who seems to make better judgments about this than others. And there are dangers here. In traditional Judaism, for example, women are excluded from this process altogether. But there are other ways of trying to do this. We want the people involved in making decisions to have a real stake in the future. We want them to have some kind of reason to weigh the future more heavily than the present. It's very easy for an electorate to value the present over the future. How do you get people to value the future appropriately and to weigh it at least as heavily as the present? Well, maybe you think you have some way of doing that, identifying people who are going to do that. Now, of course, it's hard to identify such a group, but the idea that some people may have a greater concern for passing on the tradition than others does give you some reason to say, let's let a broader group, but only those people, be involved in making decisions about the form that the tradition takes and the way in which we transmit it to the next generation. Of course, the underlying idea here is really to rely on tradition. Think about the song from Fiddler on the Roof, tradition. That really is the fundamental idea. Rabbi Akiva said that tradition is the rampart around the law. So tradition itself serves as something of a safeguard. As long as we observe the tradition, we are going to be protecting the law and transmitting it in something like the original form to the next generation. We've got to stress the importance of continuity with the past. We've got to stress that we must not be hasty in judgment, but instead place appropriate value not only on the future, but on the past as well. People over generations, over centuries, have been developing these ways of solving problems. The wisdom of past generations, all of their experience, is embodied in that tradition. That's not to say the tradition is infallible, that it doesn't have to adapt to new circumstances. Of course it does. But there is a huge amount of wisdom and experience contained in it. And so we've got to be very careful about it. Before anything else, our rule should be preserve that tradition. And make changes then only very carefully, only weighing the values of the past, their experience, their wisdom, together with our concern for the future, and trying to make minor adjustments to the tradition gradually in order to give it in a successful and strengthened form to the next generation. Now, to do this, we need to observe and maintain rituals, symbols, other things that are ceremonies that allow us to pass on the values of the tradition. Some of these rituals, ceremonies, symbols, in isolation may not seem to have any particular meaning, but they are important ways to preserve an identity, to get people to identify with a tradition, with a set of ideas. And so be careful about those traditions. Don't throw out ceremonies, rituals, other kinds of symbols easily. Don't do it without very, very careful consideration. And the reason is that that is part of what identifies this tradition. It doesn't maybe have any independent significance. That's not the point. The point is to mark this tradition as this tradition and to allow people to identify with that tradition.